Good afternoon. My name's Kim Yates, and I am very privileged and proud to be your host for today for the third in our series this week of the Carbon Crunch. I'm the UK and Europe Sustainability and Climate Change Lead for Mott MacDonald, and today we're going to be talking about transport. So if we move on to the next slide, please. So in terms of the carbon crunch, as I said, we're focusing on transport, but this is following hot on the heels of the previous 2 days, not least of which was yesterday, which was looking at energy and energy the nexus. And part of our decarbonisation of transport means that our energy networks need to prepare for the EVs and the technology that's going to be brought forward in the future. And part of the decarbonisation and heading towards net zero is really thinking about this systems of systems thinking. Nothing can be done in isolation. And we know that we are going to continue to want to travel, and we're going to continue to demand low carbon, decarbonised travel solutions in the future. So again, I'm very, very privileged to be here, to be your host, and to be introducing the next lineup of speakers. But before I do, just to remind you that tomorrow we'll be having our final session on the net zero built environment. We'll be looking at how you tackle heat and retrofitting, as well as looking at the embodied carbon associated with building and retrofitting, etc. And again, this is all part of this whole system approach to decarbonising not just the UK, but on a global basis for hitting those net zero targets and maintaining our temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. So again, pre-COP, 1st of November, exciting time. Let's see what's announced. But again, this is our discussion point from that. So before we start, I'm just going to launch into a few housekeeping bits and bobs. It's the boring bit. I always feel like an air stewardess. If we were in a room together, I'd be pointing at the fire exit, but unfortunately we can't do this today. So if there is a fire drill, please move to your nearest exit. But our presenters will be presenting their thoughts, but afterwards we will have a panel discussion and question and answer session on all the presentations. So please, please, please post your questions in the chat and we'll present them to the speakers. And I'm hoping, because transport is such a major part of our carbon footprint, for a really lively discussion and panel debate. If you like a particular question, please use the like function, and that helps us filter ones which are the most important, which questions we can present to the panel. So basically you make my life a lot easier, so thank you. And after the event, we will be publishing the contents of these webinars, and we'll have a publication that we'll be sending to you. And also, just to make you all aware, this webinar is recorded, and again, those recordings will be made available if you want to tune back or recommend to your friends. So following on from that one, if we move to the next slide, please. So today's agenda, we have a jam-packed agenda. So first of all is Leon Daniels, who's the Vice President of the Chartered Institute of Logistics, Transport, member of the DFT Net Zero Transport Board. And he will be talking about the transport decarbonisation roadmap that was recently released by the Department for Transport. Moving on, we will then have another presentation from Andrew Kluth, who will be talking to us about incentives to decarbonise rail. And I think, as we all acknowledge, rail is a sustainable mode of transport. So we're looking at the strategy, implementing it into a sector, and the rail sector in particular. And then we move to Mari Joyce, who will be talking about, again, the one step removed, about the appraisal guidance and embedding net zero into how you actually see what transportation solutions should be going forward from a business case perspective. So I will move on to our speakers, and our first speaker is Leon Daniels, OBE. And he has been in the transportation industry for 40 years. I hope you don't mind me saying that, Leon. So you know, basically, you know your stuff about transport. And I was looking through your profile in LinkedIn, and I saw that you're also a member of the Court of the Worshipful Company of Carmen, Fellow of the Chartered Institute of Transport, and Fellow of the Institute of Couriers. And you're going to present to us your take on the Transport Decarbonisation Plan. So I shall stop prevaricating and pass on to you, Leon. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, very much, and you're very generous in your introduction. Decarbonisation in 8 minutes is the brief, so here I go, Chair. I'm Leon Daniels, and my last proper job was as Managing Director Surface Transport at TfL. Since retiring from there, I've been working with a wide range of companies around the world on a wide range of issues, and needless to say, air quality and zero emission are both near the top of the list for many organisations. Everyone's got something to say about it, from the wildly cynical, who also believe the world is flat, to the fanatic endorsers who are just encouraging us to go at breakneck speed into decarbonisation. So I've played a small part in this. I brought the first hydrogen buses to London. Believe it or not, that was 2004, and we've had hydrogen buses in London ever since. And also I brought the first battery electric buses into London as well. And as you know, all new buses in London are now zero emission. I'm also a member of the government's Net Zero Transport Board, which is chaired by the Secretary of State. And we give strategic advice to the government on decarbonisation. We were significantly involved in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, which I know you've all read. Now, look, it's really easy to get into the weeds, so I think it's always useful to remind ourselves constantly when we're talking about decarbonisation that we have two really spectacular sources of energy, the sun and the wind, and both are free, and the only cost is in harnessing it and putting it to work. And I say only because that cost does include the use of precious metals, can involve creating greenhouse gases, there can be quite significant energy losses in the conversion processes, and there can be lots of issues about the end of life for this stuff as well. So I think we're making great strides in some areas. There's a rapidly maturing passenger car and bus zero emission market. Solutions for heavier and longer distance vehicles are some way behind, but at least there is a trajectory. Really, the toughest part of the TDP was really wanting to be as adventurous as possible on shipping and aviation, which is where the problems are obviously not only significant, but have huge implications for infrastructure globally, and of course, some political ones as well. There is in the Transport Decarbonisation Plan a bit of a conflict with the government's own Build Back Better programme, because that hopes for a UK-based recovery. But the truth is, it's very hard for anybody to progress zero emission without international assistance. And it's worsened by the fact that the good Lord put many of the precious metals we need in countries which either have poor human rights records or significant challenges in terms of geology and access. And I think it also has to be said that, of course, China has led the way in battery technology. Those zero emission buses that we have in London all have Chinese underframes, traction power and batteries. And as you know, there's often a slight whiff of anti-Chinese sentiment from the West for political reasons, nothing to do with decarbonisation. Kim, I know as chair you won't allow too much debate in the battery versus hydrogen argument, which is a bit like VHS and Betamax, because that's where the public does like to take us. As far as I'm concerned, for road vehicles, battery electric is here and is maturing rapidly. Hydrogen has taken a long time to develop. It always seems to be about to happen tomorrow, but I think is likely to be in the mix for long distance heavy vehicles, as well as maritime and as well as aviation. Indeed, the very latest aircraft design from Embraer envisages turboprops at the rear of the aircraft. And the reason for that is that in due course, requirement for hydrogen in aircraft, you can't store hydrogen in long, thin, flat tanks like in aircraft wings. So you have to have engines close to where you can put proper hydrogen tanks. Aviation is going to be a tough area to crack, and we should look forward to the United Nations International Civil Aviation Organization's 2022 Assembly for the agreed way forward on carbon reduction globally. And one more thing about hydrogen, let's not forget it is not limited to just using hydrogen to make electricity with a fuel cell. You can use hydrogen as a fuel in an internal combustion engine, and indeed you can use ammonia as well. So I think there could be some really interesting developments with hydrogen as a fuel in the future. So of course everything has consequences, and one we are already seeing here in the UK is a post-COVID car-led recovery. Adding to the congestion and to the pollution. And that marriage that we've had for so many years of the twin evils of congestion and air quality damage is over. And one of the unhappy consequences for this divorce is that a city full of zero emission cars is still a city going absolutely nowhere. Not only must the government learn how to think and deal with the smug looking faces behind the wheel of electric cars, but also, more importantly, consider how it's going to replace the annual 2.8 billion of lost fuel duty. There's nothing about that in the TDP. The fuel duty, that 2.8 billion doesn't pay just for roads, it pays for hospitals, schools and aircraft carriers. And I imagine the Chancellor must be having some really sleepless nights on how to replace it. Road user charging could be the answer, but that has got the words political suicide stamped on the box. As we're going to hear later, passenger rail, of course, decarbonisation is being led by Network Rail's own decarbonisation plan. The statistics are really quite good. Rail only creates 1.5% of the UK's domestic transport greenhouse gas, but it does involve 10% of domestic passenger miles. The plan removes diesel rail vehicles by 2040, and given that it won't be possible to electrify the whole network either physically or economically, it does mean there'll have to be some sort of onboard energy storage for rail, and right now batteries just don't cut it. So the pace of the TDP is fast. It's linked to a recovering UK economy, and it's got some really tough deadlines. In the UK, of course, we have greater devolution here. So in the UK, there are even tougher deadlines than the national ones for road vehicles. Many cities have got earlier deadlines for the move to zero emission, all of course well inside the Paris 2050 agreement, which we must never forget is legally binding on the UK. Actually, 2 countries have already met their Paris 2050 air quality targets. You can impress your friends by remembering that that's Bhutan and Suriname, which is a great deal for them, but not so much for the progress required in the rest of the world that, of course, we all have to share. So shortly, the UK will host COP26 in Glasgow, which is a major event in progressing for better air quality around the world. We can expect the supply chain to be showing off all of its latest innovations and products. This is really an area, where the UK can excel, and I'm looking forward to it. You can expect, a bit like the Farnborough Air Show, you can expect a number of major announcements by the industry and by the government. None of those announcements are being reserved for the event ready to be announced in Glasgow. Of course, this is going to be a hot topic for years to come, and the TDP recognises that, and so does the government. And I think one of the biggest hurdles that the government has to overcome is public perception, because this is a democracy, and it is really difficult to introduce some of the measures that you need to improve air quality in that democracy. So any dinner party you care to name, you'll find somebody around the table that says they're not going to buy an electric car because the manufacturing process creates more greenhouse gases than the tailpipe emissions that it's going to serve. This is just wrong. It could be nearly true in a country that's really reliant on coal to generate its electricity, but it's at least 30% greener for the UK and up to 70% greener in countries with nuclear and sustainable levels like Sweden and France. And in the same political bravery, in a couple of weeks now, London's Mayor Sadiq Khan will be widening the ultra-low emission zone, which inevitably, will bring further criticism from all of those people who believe in decarbonisation generally, except when it affects them personally. And then finally, for ourselves, we mustn't forget what we can do, and the TDP does talk about not just big global organisations and corporates, but also individuals. We can all help. So UK Energy, did you know, is greenest between 10 in the morning and midday, and at its worst between 4 and 6. Sustainability is what we need, and we should know what that feels like. So right now, if you're burning electricity, either to charge your vehicle, to run your lights, or have your fridge, or whatever it is, the mix at this very moment is electricity is provided by 42% gas, 23% wind, 11% nuclear, 7% biomass, and 6% solar. And just never forget that the cheapest and greenest energy that you can possibly use is the energy you don't use. So switch it off. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much for that, Leon. It's quite an undertaking trying to condense the whole of the TDP into 8 minutes. But you achieved it. So thank you. So next we're moving on to Andrew Kluth, and he's going to talk about the work that he's been leading in terms of incentivisation and supporting behaviour change, again on that decarbonisation journey. So again, Andrew, had a look on LinkedIn, and again you've had a very long distinguished career in sustainability and a sustainability professional. I think from my perspective, I found it fascinating that you were a mediator for a year, for over a year, and sorting out £25 million of assets during a dispute, and that was most intriguing. But I will again stop prevaricating and pass over to you, Andrew, to take us through incentivisation of the rail decarbonisation programme.
Thanks a lot, Kim. Well, Leon's already given a good background to the TDP. If you give me the next slide, please, I'll put this into a little bit of context. But what I'm going to be talking about is specifically how we're trying to incentivise decarbonisation within the rail industry. But that fits within a much wider research programme. So what happened in the rail industry really kicked off about 3.5 years ago when Joe Johnson, the then rail minister, asked the rail industry to come up with a plan as to how it's going to decarbonise and how it's going to get diesel-only trains off the railway by 2040. And there's a task force set up. I was doing some consulting work at the time, but a friend of mine asked me to join RSSB to support that task force. So I researched and did the writing for that pair of reports, which went to the minister. And these have all fed into the decarb research programme, which in themselves have fed into the Traction Decarbonisation Network Strategy, which is referenced in both the Williams-Shapps Plan for Rail and the TDP. That sets out where we can electrify. As Leon said, it's useful where it's cost effective to do so, and where it's only possible to use electrification with high speed, long distance and with heavy freight. But in other areas where it's economically difficult to justify, we've recommended the use of hydrogen battery trains, and the TDNS has sort of divvied up the UK or the GB rail network to work out where that's going to apply. And that's been picked up within the DDP and elsewhere. Whilst we were researching the report, the Committee on Climate Change made the recommendation to government to go to net zero by 2050. So we had a really clear target to aim towards. And we're now developing a whole industry strategic plan, which is trying to shape out what we do over the next 30 years. And there's a sustainable rail strategy as part of that. And then within the wider activities within the rail industry, we've got the rail technical strategy, which is trying to pull together research, both academic and practical, from elsewhere within the industry. And finally, Network Rail, as the asset owner, is the big driver of the process. And so they've got a sustainability strategy enterprise risk register. And we do an enormous amount of consultation to make sure that this industry level decarbonisation that we're trying to lead from within the RSSB research programme, actually both addresses and incorporates the activities of individual organisations within the industry. It is not a coherent industry in terms of sort of common aims and objectives, and we have to make sure we pull it all together to get that net zero as an industry. Next slide, please. So what we do have is a series of projects, some of which are pretty technical. So on the left-hand side, you can see we've done a lot of work on trying to define requirements for hydrogen battery trains and for infrastructure. We've also done a lot of work trying to understand what, as an industry, we need to be doing. So there are some of those projects there which are highlighted with a bright red boundary, T1197, T1198 and T1201 on the left-hand side, and then T1227 and T1228 in the middle. And there's a sort of thread through these because, first of all, in order to understand how we can go about decarbonising, we need to understand roughly what the size of our footprint was, roughly what the sources of emissions were, and also who would take responsibility for dealing with those emissions. So T1197, put that together and then try to look at good practice elsewhere with the science-based targets and other activities, which would give us some guidance in those areas. T1198 was then saying, okay, if we need to get to net zero by 2050, how do we set 5-yearly interim targets, and how do we actually plot out pathways that are both reasonable in terms of cost-effective ways of hitting that 2050 target, but also take into mind the fact we've got to renew rail fleet, we've got to do some significant improvements to the rail network, and there's a whole lot of other activity going on with infrastructure as well as traction. And T1201 follows on from that and saying, okay, if we need to hit those targets, how do we actually incentivise ourselves as an industry to deliver that? And we're going to be feeding in through in the next phase of our activity into industry decarbonisation action plans, which are looking at how, as an industry, we can coordinate that drive to net zero, and also making sure that the activities we're undertaking as an industry within the boundaries we control don't then just cause problems outside the rail supply chain. So if you move on, please, to the next slide. T1201 and T1198, the targets and the incentives projects, are not actually setting out standards or requirements for the industry as a whole. What they are doing is providing advice and guidance to the Department for Transport, who will set targets and who will put in place the appropriate incentives. And 1201 itself was designed to take a review of all mechanisms already available to the GB rail industry, mechanisms available to rail industry elsewhere around the world, mechanisms available to regulated industries and to others, exploring ways of reducing carbon impact within their operations. We're about, I would say, 80% through the process at the moment. We've presented a suite of options to DFT already, and we've consulted on those pretty widely within the industry. What we have found is that the long list, the original long list of perhaps 30 or 40 ideas, is narrowed down pretty rapidly into 3 or 4 maybe key considerations. At the moment, we've been going through a stress testing process to understand what the implications of those are. What we do find is that we have to be aware of modal shift, that the rail industry is not operating in isolation, but is dependent on what's going on in decarbonisation, particularly in the road network in this country. And we want to be able to follow up on the requirements within the TDP, the Transport Decarbonisation Plan, to encourage modal shift to the railway. We're only running 30 or 40% of total loading that we could. We have a lot of capacity available, both as a result of COVID, but also in off-peak times, we have a lot of spare capacity. And so it is possible to drive modal shift to the railway very easily with the right incentives in place. But we need to make sure that we're doing it for the right reasons, that we're not just trying to drive people onto the rail system, but that we're doing it when it's appropriate to do so. If, say, in rural lines where we're never going to get that sort of level of usage, there's no point in running a train, I would say that we should be making the argument equally not to run the journey. As Leon said earlier on, the cheapest energy use is not to use it at all. But we have to make sure that this is built into the business planning process for the industry as a whole, that we run alongside the imperative to maintain a safe transport system, but also that we provide a reliable one, and one that meets the capacity demands for passengers and freight in the future. And it's becoming increasingly obvious that trying to build incentives around those demands is really challenging. We are having discussions with the department at the moment because there are implications for pretty well every incentive we recommend or we're thinking recommending in terms of knock-on effects in terms of taxation or consequences outside the rail industry or even consequences outside the transport industry as a whole. And this is something that I think we will have to sort of continue picking up on in future projects. Next slide, please. One thing I would like to sort of just flag up is we started off with a really basic question, which was get diesel-only rail trains off the railways by 2040 and come along with a vision for decarbonisation. So the task force tried to answer that immediate exam question. That raised a whole load of issues, and we knew we needed net zero by 2050. We started exploring the options of viable technologies that would be mature within the timeframes, and discovering that we needed to be able to consolidate and understand and reinforce the imperatives for driving in those directions. This has enormous financial and policy implications. I think Leon picked up on a bit of those, but within a sort of struggling rail industry at the moment, as we try to pick up post-COVID, those issues and those challenges are being amplified and obviously being challenged pretty hard by government as a whole and DfT in particular. But that means that we have to keep on talking all the time, and we're trying to always make sure that the decarb programme is up to date. And working within the reality of those drivers, that we need to make sure that we're not staying hermetically within the rail system as we have done in the past, that we're explicitly informing DfT thinking, that we're looking at those commitments made in the TDP and working out how to deliver those in an appropriate manner, and also making sure that we're pacing progress. We need to get to net zero. You can do it quickly or you can do it slowly. What we need to do is find effective mechanisms. But the final thing I just want to sort of flag up is in this dash to net zero, we need to make sure that in a post-carbon society, where notionally we are working in a low carbon or zero carbon economy, that we also aim to make sure that the rail system, the transport system as a whole, and the UK economy as a whole is actually working in a metric which also makes sense, which is going to be an efficiency in the future, where we're looking at the value that the rail sector brings, that the transport sector brings to a low carbon economy. And that's going to be requiring changes, fundamental shifts, not just in the rail industry itself or in the transport industry, but in the way that we live and work and play across the UK as a whole. And I think part of this sort of dash to recovery post-COVID, we could lose some opportunities at a very early stage if we're not careful. And I think we just need to keep bearing in mind that in trying to drive an economic recovery in the short term, that we don't lose sight of those long-term goals to 2050 and beyond. So I'd like to leave it at that point there and hand back to Kim. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and especially ending on the note of the short-term goals of recovery. You've still got to have in mind those long-term goals of decarbonisation. So I think you hit the nail on the head there, Andrew. Thank you. So our next presenter is Mary Joyce, and she's going to be talking about the Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance Update. Mary is a well-respected and very experienced transport planner, and her passion, I would say, is to work with communities and partners to create effective plans for the future of transport. She has been working across the world and returned from New Zealand, I think about 5 years ago, Mary, to join us in Mott, MacDonald. But again, without further ado, I'll let Mary talk us through the work that she's been doing with the Scottish Government. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Kim. Yeah, so unfortunately our client Stephen Cragg couldn't make it today because he's attending the other hot transport planning event this week, which is Modelling World. But Transport Scotland have very kindly agreed that I can present for them, and if anyone has any questions that I'm unable to answer, I can put you directly in touch with Transport Scotland. So I'm going to talk through the update to the Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance, or STAG, which has included consideration of a whole host of things around inclusive growth, well-being, the economy, placemaking, as well as other factors around how it's presented and format, etc. But specifically today, I'm going to talk to you about how we are proposing to incorporate Scotland's climate change commitments through the update to the appraisal guidance. So if we go on to the next slide, please. So firstly, what is STAG? So Scottish Transport Appraisal Guidance, it's been around since 2003, when it was issued by the then Scottish Executive for use on any transport projects applying for funding. And they did a substantial update in 2008 where they've split it into two parts. So there's a kind of manager's guide, which is a bit more of a high level overview of the assessment process. And then there's a technical database which kind of drills down into exactly the specifics of how to do the different assessments. So since 2008, there has been some business as usual updates to the technical database, but nothing to the overall manager's guide. So this is the kind of first big overhaul they've done in a while. And this presentation focuses specifically on updates we're making to the manager's guide, but it also touches on some of the work being done to the technical database as well. And in terms of how this fits along with all the other business case guidance, so for those of you familiar with the 5-case business case model, an appraisal using STAG will create a strategic business case comprising of the first two of the cases, so strategic and socio-economic. And then there's other Scottish specific guidance which provides guidance on the other cases as well. So we go on to the next slide, please. So in terms of what Transport Scotland are trying to achieve through the update to STAG, so the main kind of drivers for change are primarily is the policy changes, and I'm going to go through those, the specific climate change related policy drivers that we take into account in a moment. But we also incorporated user feedback, which we received through our user workshop day and a user survey. And lastly, we also needed to ensure that the guidance was keeping up to pace with what practitioners were actually doing on the ground, as in some circumstances kind of standard practice had actually overtaken the guidance. So we go on to the next slide. So this looks at some of the specific climate change policy that we have been incorporated. I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but you can, in summary, you can see that Scotland has slightly more ambitious net zero targets than the UK as a whole. And there's some specific targets there related to specific dates about reducing car kilometres and decarbonising scheduled flights and the railway as well. And update to STAG is actually specifically included as a recommendation in the infrastructure investment plan, which aims to ensure that the appraisal guidance aligns with the net zero targets. So we're specifically addressing a commitment that the Scottish Government has made there. And also we're taking into account the National Transport Strategy, which was updated in 2020, and it also includes specific priorities and outcomes around meeting net zero targets and adapting to climate change. And lastly there, I've also put the regional and local transport strategies. STAG is really hot and keen on making sure that we are following a place-based approach, and the majority, I'd like to say all, but I haven't checked every single one, but the vast majority definitely include climate change outcomes and priorities within their own regional plans. Go on to the next slide. So in terms of some of the key considerations that came about when we were going through this process to make sure that we're incorporating these policy commitments, we talked a lot about what the actual role of appraisal was, and specifically appraisal guidance in meeting net zero targets. So it's pretty clear to most of the people working in the team that appraisal has a really important role in providing decision makers the information they need and making sure that they're able to make informed decisions on the impact of options on climate change targets. But there were some differing views on whether there was a role in appraisal guidance to specifically prioritise options which contribute to net zero targets or penalise options which work against them. So that kind of came up as a theme. STAG, as I said, has always been really strong on the kind of place-based approach, and it requires when you're coming up with your transport planning objectives that you make sure that they're rooted in evidence related to the study area. And there was a bit of feedback saying, well, climate change is a global issue, and some people felt it's difficult to kind of demonstrate potential impacts on specific geographies, even though clearly it is something that everyone needs to address. And it has that, it then works up to the higher level. So it's kind of working through those challenges moving forward. We reviewed the existing STAG criteria, so there are specific criteria that options need to be assessed against, and we map those criteria against the new National Transport Strategy priorities and outcome to understand what information decision makers actually need to understand how options might perform against the updated climate change priorities, and whether STAG was sufficient in that regard. And we also got feedback from users saying that they were kind of struggling to understand how to measure the impact of their options against net zero targets, and where to begin when thinking about adapting to climate change. So we considered guidance on sort of standard measurements and additional training. And lastly, I suppose we were just also really aware in terms of the expectations around the need for the updated guidance to sufficiently address climate change and recognise the climate emergency. So we go on to the next slide. So some of the options we specifically considered. So as I said, we talked about whether the guidance should effectively prioritise climate change requirements over others. So for example, should there be a requirement to sift out options which were inconsistent with net zero targets? Should there be a requirement to assess transport planning objectives against net zero outcomes? Or should actual climate change objectives be treated in the same way as other national policy objectives, which for STAG is through what we call a policy assessment framework tool. And there's ways of kind of amending that, which essentially is a spreadsheet-based tool, which allows you to make an assessment in terms of policy fit. And we can look at making that more specific to the kind of climate change outcomes and priorities. We considered the need to amend the current STAG criteria, which include measuring user carbon, but was currently a kind of subsection of the overall environment criteria. And we also looked at the sustainable investment hierarchy, which is a fundamental principle in the National Transport Strategy, and it aims to promote sustainable transport options by prioritising effective use of existing infrastructure and demand management before considering new infrastructure options. So we also looked at ways to incorporate this through, for example, requiring options to be identified according to the hierarchy and requiring options at the top of the hierarchy to be prioritised over those further down. So if we go on to the next slide. So in terms of kind of where we have essentially settled on right now. So after all that discussion, we eventually came down to the fact that the kind of overall opinion was that the role of the appraisal guidance was to ensure that the relevant information is made available to the decision maker. It wasn't the role of the appraisal guidance to specifically prioritise some outcomes over others. But we did come up with them. We have amended the STAG criteria, so there will be a new STAG criteria called climate change, separated out from the environment, which includes sub-criteria on carbon emissions, but also resilience and adapting to climate change. The policy assessment framework tool, which is the spreadsheet-based tool I talked about before, which allows a kind of policy fit assessment, that will be amended to specifically address climate change policies, along with a lot of the other priorities outlined in the NTS. And also there is currently a requirement to demonstrate consideration of sustainable transport and sustainable investment hierarchies in options identification. And then in terms of next step moving forward, so the amended guidance is currently out for consultation. So I think it was released last week, and we're waiting for feedback. There's also an ongoing process that Transport Scotland are working on in terms of updating the decision-making guidance as well. So although I've talked about the role of appraisal guidance might not be to prioritise climate change actions, they might have a different output in terms of what that investment decision-making guidance might look like. And then we're also looking at updating the technical database, as Scottish Government as a whole is looking at how they assess carbon emissions across infrastructure as a whole, not just transports. We need to be aware of that. Also, where the DFT guidance is coming out on providing more information on how we should be looking at carbon. And also WellTag is also currently going through an update, which and they sit on our external advisory board, so keeping in touch with them around that as well. Also, what came out really strongly was that need for additional training for users, and that's something else that Transport Scotland have committed to deliver moving forward. I think that's everything from me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Murray. And I think we've covered the full gambit from planning, business cases through to policy level at the TDP and trying to implement it within a sector, as I said. And I am very relieved to see that we've got lots of questions for you. So thank you very much for that. So I'm going to go to you, Leon, for the first of many questions, and then I'll come back to you, Andrew and Murray. Is we need a systems level approach. Energy, transport, housing, spatial planning in cities, business investments, etc. are all interrelated, and I think we've seen that across the whole of the carbon crunch this year. How can we get everyone on the same page to deliver the change that is needed? So first of all to you, Leon, and then I'll come to Andrew and Murray.
Golly, what a brilliant question, and of course the answer is blindingly obvious, but the execution of it is extraordinarily difficult because, you know, as the questioner rightly says, this is across every aspect of our lives, about how we behave, how we travel, the industries that we have, and so on, and all in a democracy. So, you know, it strikes to the very core of the decarbonisation problem, which is firstly this wide range of opinions that people have. There's the speed at which it's got to be achieved. There's the depth that has to be achieved in order to meet all our 2050 and other obligations. And in our case, all in a democracy, where there are going to be, between now and 2050, several general elections where the voters may well continue to express their satisfaction or otherwise with the policies being taken by the government, and then equally to look overseas and see what is happening elsewhere, because the rate of progress will again be different in different countries, and again clearly we'll be making lots of comparisons about how things are doing. But you have to say it is a job for government. It is a job. It's a job where government has to really clearly set out what it wants to achieve and how it wants to get there. It does need to cover every aspect, because, you know, transport is only one part of this mix of the energy of the greenhouse gases. Yeah, 16.2% is transport, 17.5% is buildings, 24% is energy in industry. So it isn't just a case of harmonizing the transport thing, it's about harmonizing all the energy consumption by everybody, and that's one big tall order. I wish I had the answer, and the only answer I can possibly give is that we have to keep reminding ourselves every time there is torrential rain or very hot days that climate change is real, and therefore these steps that we're taking are absolutely crucial. And a strong message from government has to be that the later we leave it, the more extreme the measures will have to be.
Thank you for that. I was particularly interested in when you said we live in a democracy, and it made me think of what's happened in Switzerland recently, where they've had a referendum on going net zero, and it was 49% for and 51% against, so very, very split. So Andrew, from your perspective.
Again, I'd echo what Leon has said. but if you recall what I was going through with the slides, we need to sort of take a pretty systematic approach to this. We need to look at where we're trying to get to in 2050, not just as a rail industry, but as a transport sector and the whole UK economy. Another thing I would say with this is that understanding is changing very, very rapidly. When I first got involved with the task force in 2018, it was being asked to look at actual emissions from the rail industry. Within the first few months, we changed that to look at a whole life, whole system basis. And the relationships we've had with the department on this have changed significantly, I would say, over the last couple or 3 years. So I think the awareness is increasing. It doesn't in any way reduce the complexity of the challenge, but I think it's making it easier for people to be able to have these sorts of necessary debates. The one thing I would say with that question is you can't get everybody on the same page. It's not going to be a decision of consensus or absolute agreement. It's going to be one where there are going to be some very uncomfortable decisions that have to be made. And notwithstanding the fact that parliaments last 5 years, and obviously political parties want to either get into or stay in power, that those decisions are going to have to be made one way or another.
Yeah, I think, yes, as you say, some very, very difficult conversations are being had left, right and centre to try and achieve this agenda. And Mari, from your perspective?
I think as well, it's kind of echoing as well what Andrew and we've already said already, but around the idea of over the next 12 months, we've got COP. Hopefully, as we said, there'll be lots of announcements, and I think it's just kind of really building off that. And I really like the idea about if government is going, you know, comes in terms of clear announcements, clear plans, what's going to happen. I think the main thing then that we need to do is to start engaging that conversation with our communities as well, so that they're kind of up to speed on what's happening. And while we may not be able to get some kind of agreement with everyone, I think at the moment I'm not sure that it's really in everyone's mind as much as it needs to be in terms of what type of changes need to occur. And I think the sooner we start that conversation, the better.
So another question is, so I'll be coming to you first, Andrew, and then Leon, and then Mari. Is there more that can be done to better integrate freight movements within the UK and UK international internationally, better utilising shipping, rail and road to reduce emissions? And do you think there's a forum that can manage this?
Well, the National Infrastructure Commission produced a report in 2019 to look at the future of the UK freight system, so it's worth having a look at that and the recommendations they came out with. On the rail freight front, one of the things that we are looking at is seeing what opportunities COVID has given to encouraging modal shift to the railway. We're also looking at other research projects where there efforts being made to look at containerization and seeing how you can move from one transport mode to another more readily. One of the things with the TDP and with the Traction Decarbonisation Network strategy is saying how can we electrify key freight lines, and the basis for that will be you'll be able to move vehicles more quickly around the UK at a lower carbon cost. But then we've got to deal with the last mile interfaces where we move into terminals and to ports and so on and so forth, where you can't necessarily readily electrify given all the other activities going on in those areas. So there's a whole stack of different activities. There are, as I say, forums being led by DFT and also by, I think it's BASE who does a lot of this work, trying to understand how we can manage those interfaces between the different transport modes.
And Leon, from your perspective?
Look, nothing very much to add. We know that moving freight by rail is an incredibly good thing to do in terms of the shifting the balance from road to rail, and we know that's true. And as Andrew said, that still leaves us, of course, with the last mile. But freight also adds some complexity to the railway because Freight trains often don't move as quickly as passenger trains, and therefore threading them into the busy network can be difficult. And we have other complications. It's no secret that back at the end of last year, one of the nightly freight trains from Felixstowe docks was leaving half empty because there wasn't enough room in the port to be able to move the containers around in order to get the ones for the train in the right place to put them on the train. And so there are consequences, as Andrew says, for terminals. There are consequences for the whole logistics network. But I'm a great fan of rail freight, and I think all the steps we can make in that direction is just one more piece in a very complicated jigsaw about decarbonisation.
And Mari?
I think the only thing I'd add for this is that freight is, I think, one of the trickier parts of this, and part of the reason it's tricky is that so many different people have different responsibilities for different parts of it. So when we say, is there more that can be done differently? I wouldn't say that we have the answer, but in terms of, there's a role for local authorities at that last mile level, in terms of when you're talking about rail, you're talking about electrification, so you're looking at the government, there's the roads, there's, but then also there's things about demand management as well, and expectations around, we all like to click Amazon and get our deliveries the next day. So there's a whole host of things involved there. So some kind of more clarity on who's responsible for which parts, I think, would be really good moving forward.
Thank you. So I'll move on to my next question, and Mari, you're in the hot seat first. Okay. As someone who doesn't drive, two of the main barriers associated with rail travel are A, the cost, and B, the need for additional transportation to and from the station. Taking a bike on a train can be a complicated affair. There is limited space and difficulty difficulty booking these spaces, and the risk of being stranded mid-journey if a change is necessary. How can we best integrate rail and active travel to better optimise the door-to-door journey? So with your transport planner's hat on, take it away.
Yeah, I mean, this is definitely something that we work on quite a lot, is this idea of trying to integrate different modes. And I think it comes from looking at using that kind of place-based approach. So unfortunately, sometimes we do tend to work in silos. So if we're working on a rail project, we're doing this part. If we're working on an active travel project, we're doing this part. If we're working on a road project, we're doing this part. When actually what we need to do is be looking at transport as a whole system and working more together. And I think the idea of looking at transport hubs and mobility hubs more as places, and it's not just an entity in itself, it's about what it's there to achieve, is the way that we can address that and make sure that that integration is there.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to move on to another question. I'm going to pose this one to you, Leon, because as you can see, we've got quite a few here. Decarbonisation of transport is rightly a key priority for environmental strategies going forward. How do we balance that with the damage caused and erosion of habitat caused by mining metal, i.e. lithium, and the manufacturing process and disposal of batteries at end of life? And this is particularly referring to your Betamax VHS argument with batteries and hydrogen.
Yes, indeed. And you rightly pick up on something that I said, which of course is that in order to give zero emissions in our civilized city centres, we are ripping precious metals out of the ground in other parts of the world. They're of finite supply. There are many accusations about various forms of slave labour, child labour and so on being involved in the process of extracting those precious metals, and right the way through the process up to the end of life, in particular for batteries, about all the materials. That I think possibly leads you to a belief, and I have no scientific basis for this, but that actually the existing battery technology is just a transition through to get us net zero quite quickly, but that in the fullness of time, as other forms of energy start to become more prevalent, that actually the reliance on battery electric will fall, and we'll be using fewer precious metals. I mean, you need them for fuel cell anyway, but nothing like the consumption of precious metals. So the gamble, I think, is that other forms of renewables in use as energy sources will come along and the science will eventually make the widespread use of batteries far lower than it is presently. I wish I could quote you some definitive scientific advice on that, but I can't. But it does stand to reason, doesn't it, that simply replacing one form of causing the earth trouble with another form is of itself not sustainable. So I have my fingers crossed that a replacement for large-scale battery technology will happen in at least the lifetime of many of the people on this webinar, if not mine.
Thank you for that, Andrew. And I'm going to have one last question. And again, thank you for everyone's questions. Unfortunately, we haven't had time to get around to all of them. But this one I'm posing to you, Andrew. Why are rail fees so high? How and when can this change? A recent trip via train to Scotland from southwest England cost me £100. There was a flight from Bristol to Inverness for £23. These costs should be the other way round. Any thoughts?
I can see Leon and Marie grinning away that I've got that question and they haven't. I'm not going to answer that question because it's not mine to answer. I think that really does need to be directed at government and others. But I would say on this that one of the big issues, if we're trying to get a properly sustainable transport system where you're encouraging modal shift and maximisation of usage on railway, is to get the costs right. Now, part of this, I think, is simply that the infrastructure is inherently expensive. No rail system that I'm aware of in the world actually fully pays for itself. I spent 14 years living in Hong Kong, where I'd love to have answered the question you gave to Marie, because I could have told you about the way that they integrate transport networks there on the end-to-end journey. But the reality was that they actually made their railways pay by selling the land rights above the stations for property development. And I think you need to do things in those areas. The other thing here is that Marie's already sort of mentioned transport advice and guidance, appraisal guidance. The cost of carbon is not properly incorporated in any planning decisions at the moment. And this is one of the reasons why road transport is so relatively cheap, that the total environmental impact isn't being properly accounted for. So I'm not going to answer that question, but I would say it's really important. And one of the things that we are flagging up with trying to get to a net zero railway is the fact that if you're trying to encourage people to shift to railway, that you have to make it a competitive alternative to the other forms of transport. I think it was Leon said that we need to deal with not just the UK, but on a global basis. And this is one of the reasons why aviation and maritime are such sensitive subjects, because those are the transport modes that link us to the rest of the world. And it's going to be really difficult to make them pay their true costs and still expect to have an open society where aviation in particular is such an integral part of economic activity in this country. So no answer. I'm just flagging up additional problems and saying we need to get it right.
Couldn't agree more. And one last very fast question, because I'm aware we're running out of time. What would you like to get out of COP26, at the, see come out of COP26 in November, starting with Mari?
So yeah, I think we just need more direction from government, more urgency, more, you know, the announcements, what's going to happen. It feels like it could be really exciting, a big build up of everything's going to come out and then we're all going to be able to move forward. So I think, yeah, addressing some of the urgency is kind of what I'm looking for.
Leon?
I'm going to say that I hope at COP26 we will see output from our brilliant universities and from the brilliant people in many of our industries, our innovation, our inventiveness, and the great capacity of UK industry to bring us solutions, both physical, technical, and indeed political, that will help us get to net zero. And I hope to come away from it inspired and optimistic that we'll be able to do all the things that we need to do really quickly.
And Andrew?
I would say making sure that there are commitments which are going to be adhered to, and that we are using the immense resources and skills across business, government and academic sectors.
So thank you very much for that. And we're finishing 1 o'clock on the dot. And it just leaves me to remind you, say thank you to our speakers and panelists. Very enjoyable debate. Look out for the post-event report, and tomorrow we'll be talking about tackling net zero in the built environment. And again, it's that whole system approach. We have a number of activities in COP26. If you want to move on to the next slide. Going across COP26, which includes the Sustainable Innovation Forum and virtual and in-person events. So again, look on our website to see where we're actively getting involved. And tomorrow's agenda, if we quickly skip on to the next one, we will be having Andrew McMonagle, and he will be, he's from the Greater London Authority, and he will be talking to us about tackling heat, etc. Ross Ramsey from the Scottish Futures Trust and Esther Galaksky from Mott MacDonald will all be presenting on achieving net zero in the built environment, which is not a trivial undertaking, to say the least, though I still prefer transportation personally myself. I hope you can join us tomorrow, and thank you again for a very good and lively session, and watch this space. Thank you.
Thanks.